Well, I have Lindsay Brown with me tonight. Lindsay is a native of Wales, probably the most important thing. And he studied European history at Oxford and also theology near Paris under Henri Blocher, and 30 years in student ministry with IFES.
Actually, this is my 40th year
40th
of student
year.
ministry, Peter. 4 in Wales, 10 in Europe, 16 around the world, and then another 8 directing this network of evangelists.
Yes.
For you.
Fellowship of Evangelists of the Universities of Europe.
That's right.
And you're the international director of Lausanne as well. So
oh yeah, I forgot about that one.
Anyway, so
that's on the side, yeah.
We're delighted to have you here tonight, and we want to really hear from you about the challenges in Europe today. And what have been the encouraging signs for you for the evangelical church in Europe?
Well, it's interesting when you travel to other parts of the world how negatively people view Europe, but it's a much more complex and subtle context than many non-Europeans realize, because though you see the advance of secularism and atheism and materialism, that unholy trinity over recent decades, nevertheless, from an historical point of view, the period from 1989 has seen a time of significant openness. The fall of the Berlin Wall definitely opened up opportunities for the advance of student work in Eastern Europe. There was a work only in East Germany, really, and a small underground work in Hungary and what was Yugoslavia before '89. And since then, student ministries certainly have come into being in every country in Eastern Europe and in Eurasia also. But that's been just a reflection of the growth of the church. I mean, Albania is one of the most outstanding examples, because there were probably only 6 known Albanian Christians in the world before 1989, 3 of them living in Kosovo and the other 3 in Vienna, outside of Albania itself. But there are probably about 10,000 evangelical Christians in Albania today, so that would be encouraging. And the big surprise for many people is the growth of the church in France, the evangelical church. One could question the statistics, but apparently there were only 4,000 evangelical Christians there in 1910. When I was living in Paris through the 80s, there were perhaps 220, 230,000 evangelical Christians in the country. And today, it looks as if they're close to 500,000. So it's probably the fastest growing evangelical church in Europe. It's a church of people who come from more non-professional backgrounds, lower income. So, for example, you'd find many more medics, your kind of work, Christian medics and nurses in the UK than you would find people in those professions in France. And Philip Jenkins, the missiologist, says that he thinks there are 3 reasons for the growth of the church in France. The contribution of the diaspora, both missionaries and people coming from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Secondly, the impact of the charismatic movement. And thirdly, a focus from mission agencies going back to the late 60s, Operation Mobilization especially, on church planting, which the evangelical church in France generally is bought into across the country. So there are these encouragements, though it is, I think, the toughest continent in the world in which to work.
Yeah. Now, you're involved in a new evangelistic initiative now in the universities. And tell us a bit about that and about some of the other exciting evangelistic initiatives that you've seen.
Well, 8 years ago, within IFES, the student ministry I work with, we decided we wanted to put a focus on trying to unearth and develop a team of people who could communicate the gospel publicly in European universities. The reason for this is, if you look at church history, in 2 great periods, first of all, the early church between the end of the New Testament and Constantine in the mid-300s, the great German church historian Adolf Harnack says that the early church grew for 2 reasons. The early Christians outlived the pagans in terms of a godly lifestyle, and they out-argued them because they were a group of very fine apologists. What is interesting also about the other period, the Reformation, is that Calvin and Luther were very, very creative in terms of their public dialogues and their public communication of the gospel. They weren't just Bible teachers. They had stupendous output, literary output, Luther wrote a 200-page book on average every 2 weeks. I mean, the most prolific Christian writer of all time, probably. But both he and Calvin were involved in these public dialogues, and essentially they won the argument in public. It's my conviction, having visited student movements around the world, that you can't turn a culture around just through small group Bible study, important though that is. You have to demonstrate the superiority of the truth claims of the gospel in the public sphere, both by the public communication of the gospel through straightforward evangelistic talks or apologetics or debate. And secondly, you have to demonstrate the Christian mind when it comes to a biblical approach or a Christian approach to medicine, to education, to law, or whatever it is, trying to demonstrate that the Christian worldview is actually superior and better than alternative worldviews in these different spheres.
I guess this goes right back to the foundation of the apostles, doesn't it? Because we read about Paul in the lecture hall of Tyrannus for 2 years, so that all the people in that region heard the gospel. We hear a lot about students not being interested, young people being turned off and distracted. Is that your experience in the universities?
Well, it is true that there's an overriding apathy amongst young people in Europe. I mean, Francis Schaeffer's statement 3 decades ago still holds today, that most people are interested primarily in personal peace and affluence. I wouldn't say there's a deep searching, but I think there's a restlessness in European cultures. There's a sense of loss of confidence in different forms of authority, and most people just give themselves to fulfillment of pleasure, for example. I mean, the best-selling book in Germany a few years ago was just called The Uselessness of Being an Adult. And Neil Postman wrote his book Amusing Ourselves to Death, which was a bestseller too. And that's a reflection of our cultural context. Having said that, there was a Europe-wide survey done 3 or 4 years ago by Der Stern magazine, the German equivalent of Time magazine, about religious beliefs amongst young people in Europe. And the front page of the magazine, where they revealed the summary of the survey, was fronted with the question, why are so many European young people disillusioned with the state of the church, the institutional church, but fascinated by the person of Jesus Christ? So there is still that interest in the person of Christ. Just before he died, I talked with John Stott about this and asked him, what do you think Europeans are looking for these days, John? He said, I think the 3 things Europeans are looking for are, first of all, a search for the transcendent. And you can see that even though there's a rejection of organized Christianity, there's a search and an interest in the spiritual. Secondly, a search for community, which you can see in the Facebook generation. And thirdly, a search for hope. And you can see all of those in the student world.
And yet we're all conscious, I think, too, of a rising hostility in Europe to Christian faith and values. What do you think's motivating that? What's behind that?
Well, first of all, it has its roots in the philosophical influences in continental Europe with the rise of the Enlightenment 250 years ago. I mean, the great French sociologist Jacques Ellul said before his death a few years back that the 3 most influential figures philosophically and in the realm of ideas in Europe from the 19th century onwards were Marx, Nietzsche and Freud. Only Freud of those had a significant influence in North America. And what he went on to say about these 3 men is that they discouraged a positive faith in anything, so they were the fathers of modern day Europessimism. You never hear the term Americo-pessimism, no. Only Europessimism, and it's really coming from those figures who were all influenced by the European Enlightenment, which pushed God to the periphery and put man at the center of the universe.
So Americans escaped the Enlightenment, did they, by migrating at the right time?
No, they're influenced by it too, but it's had a deeper impact, I think, philosophically in the European context. And we really have seen the unfolding or fleshing out of that over 250 years. And all we've come to these days is expressions such as postmodernity, which is really a continuation of that resistance to the Christian worldview, on top of which you have something which is a new phenomenon, and that is a particularly aggressive form of atheism. It's a little bit different.
The new atheism.
Yeah, the new atheism is a little bit different to past expressions of atheism. It's much more hostile to the Christian faith, and people like Dawkins talk in terms of wanting to destroy people's religious faith, because they think it's not only wrong or without evidence, but that it's actually bad or evil. And so, they set their face in terms of attempting to destroy the faith of many people. This is much more aggressive than expressions of atheism I think we've seen before.
There seems to be an unwillingness to engage as well. It's more a standoff, ridicule, mock, put down, but don't really engage with Christians.
Well, some have initially. I mean, Dawkins did engage at the level of some dialogue and debate with some, but I think after his recent debates with John Lennox particularly, and one or two others, Christians who could match him intellectually, yes. I think he's retreated, and the most striking evidence of that was when he was asked to debate William Lane Craig in Oxford, and just didn't turn up for the debate. Yes. He seems to have ducked when he was challenged by people of equal sort of intellectual ability. So actually he's lost a bit of credibility amongst his peers, even his atheist friends, in the Oxford context. But at the popular level, his writings are still influential.
Lindsay, you've spent a whole lifetime really serving students and ministering to students. Why are students so strategic in world evangelism?
Well, I think firstly because all the surveys that have been undertaken in terms of when people make professions of faith indicate the vast majority of people pretty much in every country decide on their life's values, the worldview by which their lives are governed, their view of the Christian faith before they're about 25. That's in pretty well every country in the world. But the other reason is historically, again, the church has been deeply impacted when young people have become Christians. If you look at some of the revivals in Europe, for example, including in my own country, Wales, the revival following Wesley's and Whitfield's preaching, many of the people who took up leadership were converted in their early 20s. If you look at the Reformation, it's very interesting. I'd love to see somebody do research on this. There is a strong argument for arguing that the Reformation was a university triggered movement, because Luther was converted as a young theology professor himself in his late 20s, and Calvin in his Institutes says that he was converted in Orléans University in France. And you can see how their teachings penetrated universities which had much smaller numbers, of course, in Central and Northern Europe, and came over into the UK with an influence in Cambridge particularly, as well as Oxford. And there could be an argument for saying that many of the Puritan fathers who went to North America were people converted around the Cambridge area who went out from Boston on their ships to North America. So they contributed to the founding fathers in North America. So from a historical point of view, you can see that God working in the university world and European context contributed to the shaping of our countries for a 400-year period. Now, more lately, Charles Malek, the one-time president of the United Nations, in his famous lectures in the 1980s on the university said, if you want to change the world, start with the university. That doesn't mean you can't work amongst other people, but it is a significant theatre for communicating the gospel.
Yeah. Lindsay, in everything you say, what comes across very clearly is a really good grasp of European history, and I guess in order to understand where we're at now, we need to understand exactly where we've come from. Could you give us some good book recommendations for people who are wanting to engage for the gospel in Europe, really to get oriented and to understand the culture in which they're operating? Well,
firstly, more generally, if you want to go right back to the early church, there is a very powerful seminal book written by a North American professor of sociology, Rodney Stark, called The Rise of Christianity. He may have been a Christian before he wrote it, or he may have become a Christian as he was writing it, in which he traces, or he tries to answer the question, what contributed to the growth of the Christian faith in Europe between the end of the New Testament and the Constantinian period, 300 years later, when the Roman Emperor Constantine brought in the Catholic Church. And his threefold argument is basically that the early church grew firstly because of the message, Secondly, because of the dignity with which they treated women, which is really interesting. I mean, that chapter makes the hairs on the back of your head stand on end because of the way the early church viewed women as equal with men in terms of being created in God's image. And the third was, as you will know as a medic, you had some of these early pandemics, and he traces them to about 150 AD and 250 to 265 AD that swept through Europe in many of the Roman cities, killing 1/3 of the population. There wasn't much of a health service, but Christians, risking their lives, cared for people. Many died. Even the pagan emperor Julian said the Christians are outdoing us, and we better equal them if we're going to hold them back. And it's obvious that the early church grew in a staccato fashion, not like that all the time, but there's a spike in 150 and 250 AD, round about the time that these diseases were around, when the Christians were offering their lives to care for people. So that's a very powerful book on those first 300 years. As far as the impact of the Reformation is concerned, there are lots of good books available that one could read on that period. Books by Sidney Horton, V.H.H. Green, Reformation and Renaissance. Rennie's book on the history of the church, that kind of thing would be useful. Or anything by Alistair McGrath, who's written good material on the Reformation. That was his research work.
So I'm struck by Rodney Stark there, the message, the treatment of women, and care of the sick. And I guess that takes us right back to the Lord Jesus, where it all begins, the great physician, the amazing way he related to women, and of course the message of the gospel. Perhaps a final question: what can we learn from the life and ministry of the Lord on earth in terms of engaging with those with entrenched views? Because so often we feel that we're hitting our heads against a brick wall and that there's no way through. What can we learn from the Lord?
I think the first thing is that he treated people with dignity, and he took everyone as they were. So if you look at John chapter 3 and John chapter 4, he says to Nicodemus, you must be born again. He doesn't mention that phrase at all in chapter 4 when he talks to the woman of Samaria. He starts where people are, and he connects with them at their level. So he doesn't have a booklet that he's using with all and sundry.
An individualized approach.
Yeah, that's the first thing. The second is, as Andrew Fellows has masterfully demonstrated, Jesus had what he called a subversive approach, which he says was demonstrated in the way that Jesus asked questions of people. Someone's written an interesting book called Questioning Evangelism. It's a double-edged thing, questioning our style of evangelism, but really highlighting the fact that one of the things that we have neglected in terms of how we engage with people evangelistically, perhaps by being too prescriptive in feeling the need to have booklets or something that we work through with people, is the approach that Jesus had in terms of asking questions of people, sometimes even returning a question with a second question himself as a means of opening up their position. Schaeffer put it in terms of people living in closed houses, sort of where it's difficult to access them. The windows and the doors are closed, and the only way you can access them is to take their roof off, the roof off their philosophical or their worldview position. And questions help us to do this. Let me just give one illustration in that respect. My wife was asked to speak in a university meeting on the theme, Is the Bible Anti-Women? To a feminist group. About 70 or 80 women in this particular university. It was a raucous, tense meeting for about 45 minutes. I think 85% of the women present were feminists and not Christians. They were throwing questions all the time, or aggressively attacking the history of the church and as they perceived it, how they treated women. After a time of intense interaction, my wife stopped and asked one of the most aggressive young women one question. It was this. Well, what would you like God to do to demonstrate his concern for women and to demonstrate his existence? And one of the aggressive young women stopped for a moment, and then she said, if there's a God in heaven, he'd better come down from that throne of his, come into the world which he apparently created, and sort out the mess that we're in. Then she said, oh no, that's what you say, you Christians say that Jesus did, isn't it? He completely changed the environment from being very aggressive. One question turned the tables. And I think we've lost the art of asking questions as a means of interacting with people. And of course, when you ask questions of somebody else, you treat them with dignity. As you ask them more questions, eventually, very naturally, they say, well, what's your answer? What do you believe? So I think alongside proclamation and apologetics and personal conversations and small group work, we need to engage in dialoguing with people, asking questions, getting under their skin, under their position, or the position of their worldview, and eventually presenting the person of Christ.
Lindsay, thanks for answering our questions
Okay.
tonight and for your time. Thanks very much.